So now, Professor Sandra Peterson on Xenophon, Socrates, on the just and lawful in Memorabilia 4.4.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes?
Okay,
Yes.
thanks. For efficiency, I'm going to read from my document, and of course, I'm not going to read the footnotes if you've looked at it. And I've crossed out some sentences in the document that I'll omit to save time. I arrived at reading Xenophon's Socratic writings rather late in life. As I recall, it was because undergraduate classics majors that were taking a Plato course of mine in the philosophy department grumbled that Plato was not the only author that wrote about Socrates. Now I am very grateful for their grumbles. When I began to read Xenophon's depiction of his Socrates, I was immediately drawn in. I had the impression that I was reading about the same Socrates I had read about in Plato, although Xenophon presented different Socratic conversations. When I later paid attention to scholarship about Xenophon, I learned that many careful readers did not believe that Xenophon's Socrates and Plato's Socrates were the same character. I learned that there was a list of arguable differences that I had not noticed. At the present time, I realized that I must acknowledge more differences of presentation than I had noticed in my earliest reading. However, I must also acknowledge that my earliest uninformed impression has settled into a strong and lasting impression. I simply cannot shake it off. Even today, Xenophon's Socrates seems to me very much the same as Plato's. My tiny project for today is to reassess one passage that has been offered as evidence for one difference between the two Socrateses. I hope this essay is more than an exercise in diagnosis, or at worst simply display of my personal pathological incapacity to shake off my impression of a single Socrates in Xenophon and Plato. I hope that my explanation will withstand the scrutiny of others and rise to the level of a reason for my so far lasting impression. Scholars have said that an important difference of Xenophon's Socrates from Plato's is that Xenophon's Socrates gives, or thinks he is able to give, definitions of important moral terms, whereas Plato's Socrates does not. Here I consider whether Memorabilia Book 4, Chapter 4 provides evidence that Xenophon's Socrates could give such definitions. Memorabilia 4, Chapter 4 is just one passage that has been offered as evidence for that particular difference between the two Socrateses. In a responsible treatment of the difference, I would have to consider several other passages that have been given as evidence for that particular difference. I have opinions about the other passages, but Memorabilia Book 4, Chapter 4 is enough of a topic for this occasion. The passage depicts Socrates in conversation with Hippias, the famous traveling teacher and performance speaker. Socrates twice makes a declaration to Hippias that lawful and just are the same. Several authors agree that it expresses a definition that is a conviction of Xenophon's Socrates. I make two preliminary observations before I turn directly to the conversation of Hippias and Socrates. My first rather long preliminary observation is about the narrator's sentence that begins his report of the conversation. And the narrator says, I know he conversed, that's dialegesthai, about the just with Hippias as follows. I reflect on its verb, dialegesthai. I use the transliteration dialegesthai to use and to mention the verb. Dialegesthai refers to conversing of any kind. I avoid the somewhat usual translation dialectic for occurrences of dialegesthai because dialectic is too easily confused with dialektike, which is a different thing. Dialektike is the skill of engaging in the practice of a specific type of dialegesthai. LSJ gives us one sense of the word, elicit conclusions by discussion. Examples in Plato and Xenophon show us that the word has a prominent use, specifically for the exchanges of a questioner and answerer in a verbal competition of the era. The verbal competition is especially associated with young people. It can be a playful way of establishing momentary superiority or putting someone down. And in the note, I mentioned of Lysis once. Socrates did put Menexenus down with some dialegesthai. In the competitive dialegesthai of a questioner and an answerer, the answerer's role is to maintain a proposition. The questioner asks questions about it. The questioner aims to defeat the answerer by getting the answerer to commit himself to answers that lead to a contradiction or other objectionable result. The answerer tries to avoid that. In this combative dialegesthai, the questioner commits himself to none of the propositions to which he gets the answerer's assent. Similarly, in such a contest of dialegesthai, the answerer need not believe the proposition that he has undertaken to defend. He may simply be trying to show off. Some evidence of the detachment of the answerer from the position he is defending is that in the Platonic erastai, one rival lover would be willing to defend a position he does not consider correct, and he prides himself on being able to defend a weaker position against his rival. The rival lover's claim is evidence, moreover, that it shows more cleverness to withstand questioning on an initially implausible thesis. And I will mention here that the position of the answerer is much more difficult than the position of the questioner. Scholars agree that a clear example of a case of such competitive dialegesthai is at Memorabilia Book 1, Chapter 2, where the narrator relates how young Alcibiades did dialegesthai with Pericles. Alcibiades elicits contradictory admissions from Pericles, and Pericles says he used to be clever at such things when he was young. Scholars consider that passage one of the rare examples of a certain kind of alenkos, refuting, in the Memorabilia. The passage does not explicitly label it with alenkos or alenkane, but it would be appropriate to call what Pericles has experienced a refutation or an alenkos. In Plato's dialogue Euthydemus, Socrates praises the brothers Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus for doing dialegesthai finely. The brothers practice that variety of dialegesthai that consists in fighting an argument and refuting, en tois logos machisthai to kai exelenkein. Crito calls them a new kind of sophist, that is, a new kind of professional teacher. I call attention to the fact that the brothers refute by their questioning whatever may be said, whether it is false or true. They can refute or demolish any proposition. Obviously, the bouts of their game neither commit them to believing anything, nor provide any evidence of what the brothers actually believe. The inferences to which they get interlocutors to agree are often flawed, but in the quick exchange of the game, anything that gets the answerer's assent in the heat of the moment is clearly an allowable move. Their type of dialegesthai, their game, is a no-holds-barred contest in which the gamesters do not intend to uncover truths or to establish the negation of a thesis that has been demolished. However, and this makes the game of some considerable interest, a gamester might happen to hit upon some solid and thought-provoking sequence of reasoning. The game's close association with young people is perhaps a clue that this competition in who could outtalk whom, despite the existence now of new professional teachers of it, had its origins among competitive youngsters in the gymnasium or on the playground. And I would compare the origins of today's professional baseball or professional hip hop. This refuting type of dialegesthai is one of the types of conversation in which Xenophon Socrates engaged. Xenophon describes two types of Socrates' conversations in Book 1, and I quote, "If any think Socrates was strongest at exhorting people to virtue, but not sufficient to lead them to it, let them judge if he was sufficient to make his associates better when they have considered not only how in questioning he refuted, for the sake of cutting them down, those who thought they knew everything, but also when they have considered what he spent his days saying to those who regularly passed time with him. I will first say what I heard of him doing dialegesthai about with Aristodemus." And that's the end of the quote. The clause beginning "not only" tells us about one kind of activity in which Socrates, questioning, refuted for the sake of cutting them down, those who thought they knew everything. Xenophon does not imply here that Socrates had the aim of the brothers of the Euthydemus to refute propositions, true or false. Xenophon says that Socrates refuted persons, persons of a specific type. The clause beginning, but also, in the quotation I just read, distinguishes a second thing, what he spent his days saying to his regular associates. Immediately following this mention of what Socrates daily said to his associates, Xenophon relates some dialegesthai with Aristodemus, whom we know as a regular associate of Socrates. We then know that the conversation with Aristodemus is an example of the second kind of interaction, what he spent his days saying to his regular associates. This is not the place to consider that conversation with Aristodemus. I simply put together two facts about it. First, Xenophon tells us that the conversation with Aristodemus is a case of dialegesthai. Second, in that conversation, Socrates asks Aristodemus many questions and draws consequences. But Socrates does not finally draw a consequence that refutes Aristodemus. He simply reveals consequences of what Aristodemus agrees to. Hence, the conversation with Aristodemus gives us an example of a type of dialegesthai involving questioning that is different from elenchein or refutative dialegesthai. I emphasize there are at least two types of conversations that involve questioning that Xenophon calls dialegesthai. One is refutative questioning, and one is questioning that is clearly not refutative. I say at least because the passage in which Xenophon distinguishes two types of conversation does not tell us that the distinction exhausts all types of Socratic conversations. For example, it leaves open that Socrates might have refuted close associates or others, whether they claimed to be know-it-alls or not, and for some purpose other than cutting them down. A passage in Book 4 informs us about this non-refutative dialegesthai, and I will quote, "That he made his companions more skilled at dialegesthai, I will try to show also this. For Socrates thought that those who know what each of the things that are able to explain it to others. For the sake of these things, he never left off inquiring with his companions what each of the things that are is." This passage suggests that some of Socrates' dialegesthai consisted in jointly inquiring with his companions what things are, and inquiries into what things are we would, of course, call a search for definitions. Xenophon tells us further that Socrates was especially interested in what his companions knew, and I quote, "Of all those whom I knew, it was of concern most to him to know whatever one of his companions might be knowledgeable about." And that's the end of the quote. From these two passages, I gather that Socrates' concern to find out what his companions knew played a part in his inquiring what each of the things that are is. Accordingly, I would call this non-refutative sort of dialegesthai that consisted in his asking questions to find out what his companions knew, revelatory or confessional dialegesthai. That was the end of my first preliminary observation. The upshot was that Xenophon recognizes two types of dialegesthai that Socrates practices. One of them is a type of dialegesthai that involves questioning for refuting, elenchein. My second preliminary observation is that it is important to notice when Xenophon is talking specifically about refutative dialegesthai. For example, when Xenophon reports that Socrates was good at dialegesthai, Xenophon clearly refers to refutative dialegesthai, and I quote, "They," that's Alcibiades and Critias, "used to see him using," that's chromenon, "all those doing dialegesthai with him in discussion in whatever way he wished." That's the end of the quote. The verb using with its personal object, all those doing dialegesthai with him, plus the adverbial phrase, in whatever way he wished, combined to give a derogatory description of those of Socrates' interlocutors that he used in whatever way he wished. With a personal object, the verb used can indicate sexual usage, though the verb does not refer to sexual usage in the phrase using those that did dialegesthai with him in whatever way he wished, in the passage I've quoted. The whole phrase, nevertheless, goes in the direction of suggesting the interlocutor's complete submission. In this passage, Xenophon clearly reports only about those with whom Socrates engaged in refutative dialegesthai. Socrates conveys here that Socrates always won combative dialegesthai. That is the end of my preliminary observations. I now turn to my account of the dialegesthai with Hippias. I will not be analyzing details of the content of that conversation. In order to draw some conclusions of my own, I will be calling attention only to features of the conversation, some vocabulary, and some stylistic or structural features that I believe indicate that the conversation is refutative or contest dialegesthai. Hippias greets Socrates jestingly, episkopton, observing that Socrates is always saying the same things. Socrates responds in kind, saying that Hippias, on account of his being multi-learned, perhaps never says the same things. Hippias offers assurance, don't worry, that he always tries to say something new. Socrates then implicitly catches Hippias in a contradiction, because Hippias immediately admits that when asked about spelling and computation, he always says the same things. That Socrates has elicited contradictory admissions from Hippias amounts to a mini victory in a mini contest, a mini refutation. It, of course, does not meet stricter accounts of Alenkos, such as Aristotle's account in De Sophisticis Elenchis, which is reasoning accompanied by a contradiction of the conclusion. Here, no reasoning was involved. Hippias simply made contradictory statements. But the conversation is a refutation in that broad sense of refutation, in which making any embarrassing admissions counts as an alenkos of the speaker. Socrates does not call attention to this mini refutation, but Hippias agreeably says, after admitting that he says the same things on certain topics, just like you, Socrates. He does not remark that a difference is that Socrates is not inconsistent. In likening himself to Socrates, Hippias is perhaps trying to avoid the appearance of having contradicted himself. This mini refutation, initiated by Hippias' jesting greeting, in my view, sets a tone for the rest of the conversation. Hippias continues with a challenge in Book 4, Chapter 4, Section 7, saying, concerning the just, I totally think I am now able to say something against which neither you nor anyone else could counter-speak. Hippias' word counter-speak is a signal here that he now challenges Socrates to engage in combative dialegesthai. Socrates expresses amazement. He expresses interest in hearing what Hippias has to say. Hippias replies that Socrates will not hear it before Socrates himself declares what he thinks the just is. Hippias complains that Socrates is never willing to uphold an account, that's hypechein logon, nor declare a judgment about anything. Hippias' phrase, uphold an account, hypechein logon, is a further signal of a challenge to combative dialegesthai, because uphold an account is a technical phrase for the role of the answerer in a verbal contest of dialegesthai, and you can see it in Plato's Protagoras and in Aristotle's Topics. Socrates then responds to Hippias with some wordplay on demonstrate. Socrates says that he never stops demonstrating what seems just to him. Hippias apparently thinks that means that Socrates has an account to state. Hippias asks, what sort of thing is it, this account of yours? Socrates explains that he demonstrates what seems just to him in his behavior, if not in an account. However, Socrates then indulges Hippias' wish to hear a stated account. Socrates offers his stated account in a question, abstaining from unjust things. Is it not just, do you think? Hippias complains anew. He says Socrates is evading the question and not attempting demonstrating a judgment. He is only saying what the just do not do, not what they do. But now at this point, Socrates takes the conversation to a new starting place by further and fully indulging Hippias' demand to see Socrates uphold an account. Socrates gives a positive statement. He says, but if it does not seem so to you, consider if this might be more pleasing to you. I say, that the lawful person is just. I dwell on Socrates' phrasing. Consider if this might be more pleasing to you. I say. The utterance, consider if this might be more pleasing to you, has a very wide range of uses. It might be uttered in the tenderest manner by a kind nurse as she adjusts the pillow on your deathbed, or it might be uttered with a snarl by an opponent in battle as he impales you with the final thrust of his sword. Socrates' utterance is not at either of these extremes. It strikes me, however, as tending toward the latter. It strikes me as having a challenging tone that imitates the challenge that Hippias issued when boasting of his thesis about the just that no one could speak against. Accordingly, the challenging tone affects the following words, I say. In my view, the prefatory phrasing, consider if this might be more pleasing to you, makes it highly likely that the following, I say, does not amount to, I now speak to you from my heart and offer my sincere convictions. Rather, Socrates' utterance, consider if this might be more pleasing to you, I say, amounts to, let's see how you like this proposal. See what you can do with this statement. Attack it. A comparable locution in my neighborhood would be, bring it on, hit me with your best shot. That is, Socrates now indulges Hippias fully by challenging him to attack a proposal that Socrates will defend. Socrates thus agrees to serve as answerer. I would have been very interested to see Socrates in the role of answerer, so I am quite disappointed. Hippias immediately takes that role away from Socrates. Socrates' role as answerer lasts only for seconds. Hippias asks one clarificatory question. Does Socrates mean that lawful and just are the same? Socrates answers in the affirmative. Hippias then says that he doesn't understand what Socrates means by lawful or just. Socrates then, in the subsequent discussion, asks all the questions. In fact, he asks 21 questions. Hippias' one interrogative utterance, how not, meaning of course, at section 14, is an answerer's answer, not a questioner's question. When Socrates becomes the questioner, he turns Hippias into the answerer. Hippias, now taking the role of answerer, attempts to uphold the opposite of the thesis that Socrates offered. That is, Hippias is in the position of upholding or defending the proposition that it is not the case that lawful is the same as just. And I observe that a negative statement is an appropriate position to defend, and there's evidence for that in Aristotle's Topics. The point that Hippias becomes the answerer that defends a proposition is worth emphasizing because the point has been questioned. It has been asked, how could Hippias be refuted when he does not propose any definition of justice? The answer is that Hippias undertakes to defend not a definition, but instead the denial of Socrates' proposal. Socrates has perhaps manipulated Hippias into taking the role of answerer, but Hippias did not require much manipulation. It is as though Hippias cannot resist the urge to be in the position of the authority that knows, that is, the answerer. Perhaps Socrates already knew how Hippias would react. The only departures from Socrates' barrage of questions are first in section 13, when Socrates asserts an inference from Hippias' previous assents. Hippias objects. Socrates deflects the objection in section 14, and then resumes his questioning. A second departure from the questioning is in section 16, when Socrates makes three assertions to explain the importance of agreement in cities. Hippias gives spoken assent to 4 of Socrates' first 5 questions that call for a yes or no answer. The remaining question is, what do you think laws of a state are? Hippias answers that laws are what citizens, having agreed, have written down what ought to do and what to avoid, what one ought to do and what one ought to avoid. Hippias' reaction to the next 16 questions and to the 3 assertions is silence. In the setting of competitive dialegesthai, silence, that is, the absence of dissent, counts as assent. And I'll mention my evidence for that is from the Euthydemus, that's in a footnote there, where Socrates says that the brothers stitch up people's mouths, and when he's been defeated, he says, I lay speechless. So dissent has to be signified by saying something. Silence counts as assent. In section 18, Socrates sums up the result of his questioning of Hippias. So, Hippias, I demonstrate lawful and just to be the same thing. If you know the opposite, teach me. Socrates, summing up, signals that he has won the game to which Hippias challenged him. The summation also returns Socrates to his original position of the answerer that had offered the proposal that lawful is the same as just. It nevertheless does not indicate that Socrates is now stating a conviction of his own. As I have mentioned, the answerer in competitive dialegesthai is not required to believe the proposition that he defends. Here, I demonstrate signifies only that Socrates' original proposal has withstood the questioning of Hippias, which was quickly non-existent. In saying, teach me or instruct me, Socrates now invites Hippias to attempt to defend again the opposite to Socrates' proposal. Teach me has the effect of serve as answerer. It is not in the setting of contest a request for genuine teaching. See Alcibiades' challenge to Pericles in Memorabilia Book 1, where Alcibiades says, tell me, can you teach me what a law is? And then teach. It's a way of making a challenge. Hippias does not take up Socrates' challenge in section 18. In fact, Hippias acknowledges defeat. By Zeus, Socrates, I don't think I know the contrary to what you have said about the just. In here agreeing with Socrates, Hippias here resembles Hippias in Plato's Hippias Major. For there, Socrates says, and Hippias agrees, that Spartans are breaking the law by not letting Hippias educate their sons. But Hippias is inconsistent because he has previously agreed that Sparta is law-abiding. Hippias smooths over his inconsistency by saying that he doesn't oppose Socrates because Socrates is saying something helpful to Hippias. Possibly the historical Hippias had the mode of claiming at such points, at points of looming inconsistency, that there was no disagreement, to give the impression that he had not, after all, been outsmarted. Possibly the Hippias of the Memorabilia is depicted even as attempting to give the impression that his new thesis, that no one could speak against, was actually the very one that Socrates proposed and then successfully defended. Recall that Hippias also covered up the mini-refutation of his claim in section 6 with, just like you, Socrates. As I said earlier, I do not here consider in any detail the content of this conversation with Hippias between sections 12 and 18. I have called attention only to features of its vocabulary and structure. The features to which I called attention were these 5. Hippias gives a jestingly mocking greeting that moves Socrates to give a mini-refutation. Hippias boasts of having a position that is immune to counter-speaking, that's ant epein. To describe what he wants from Socrates, Hippias uses the phrase hupechein logon, which is a term of art from refutative dialegesthai. Socrates' phrase, consider if this might be more pleasing to you, is a challenge, I believe, to attack him as answerer. And Socrates asks 21 questions. In my view, this vocabulary and structure indicate that the conversation is refutative dialegesthai, in which Socrates is, most of the time, the questioner. My conclusion from these features is that the conversation, therefore, provides no evidence for what Xenophon Socrates actually believes, and thus no evidence for his definition of the just. And I think I have time to read a paragraph that I crossed out, so I'll do that. I do not have space to discuss the continuation of the conversation from section 18 to section 25, although that conversation about unwritten divine law is worth consideration in its own light. I don't find that that portion of the conversation casts doubt on my understanding of what precedes it. Socrates initiates the discussion of unwritten or divine laws, then he asks questions of Hippias, that Socrates concludes by drawing a consequence from Hippias' previous answers to questions, is a sign again that Socrates is questioner and Hippias answerer. That conversation, with Socrates serving as questioner, tells us not what Socrates believes, but only what Hippias agrees follows from other agreements on that occasion. It's striking that Socrates begins the conversation of sections 18 through 25 by asking, do you know unwritten laws? Previously, Hippias has explained laws of the state as what the citizens wrote. Apparently, we are to infer that Hippias distinguishes between laws of the state and laws. Socrates extracts, in section 23, Socrates extracts an inconsistency from Hippias. Hippias first implies that good men and good women do not produce children badly. Then Hippias later simply agrees that good people, not both in their prime, do produce children badly, without retracting his earlier implication. This seems another example of Hippias smoothing over an inconsistency. My own view is that on the topic of the just and its connection with the lawful or legitimate, Xenophon Socrates probably thinks whatever is most reasonable. I do not know what that would be. For all I know, Socrates may simply think that no formulation he has so far heard can maintain consistency. I will add here a further comment on the competitive dialegesthai that I've already mentioned, in which the young Alcibiades defeats Pericles in Book 1, Chapter 2. Socrates is not part of that conversation with Pericles. The narrator tells us that Alcibiades has been associating with Socrates. The position that Pericles cannot maintain against Alcibiades is the position that laws are what the people in power decree. Scholars have thought that this passage suggests that studying with Socrates has given Alcibiades the skill to defeat Pericles in discussion. I would describe differently what Alcibiades has acquired from Socrates. In my view, what Xenophon wishes to suggest here is not that Alcibiades has gotten from Socrates a skill which would require some creativity. Rather, Alcibiades has memorized an argument, and I would expect, or at least suspect, that it is an argument by which Socrates previously refuted and humbled Alcibiades. That people memorized Socrates' arguments is suggested by, in Book 1, Chapter 2, Section 60, where the narrator reports that some people got for free from Socrates a few small parts and then sold them to others for a lot. I believe small parts refers to arguments that listeners memorized. Alcibiades, I believe, used his memorized argument to refute Pericles, and this probably was not what Socrates intended. I now address a question that arises sharply from both the introduction and the conclusion to the chapter that contains the conversation with Hippias. Both remind us of the beneficial effect of Socrates. The introduction tells us that Socrates dealt lawfully and helpfully with everyone personally. The conclusion to the chapter tells us that Socrates made his associates more just. So we have the two questions. How does this competitive conversation with Hippias illustrate that Socrates dealt lawfully and helpfully with Hippias? And how does this conversation make Socrates' associates more just? Here is a partial and possible explanation of how Socrates deals lawfully or legitimately as well as beneficially with Hippias. Socrates deals with Hippias lawfully or legitimately in that he deals with Hippias as he deserves. If there were a good law covering these matters, what Socrates does would be what the law prescribes. Socrates deals beneficially with Hippias because to defeat Hippias in dialegesthai might make Hippias realize that he cannot coherently maintain his chosen position. For Hippias to know his limits would be a benefit, because to think you know what you do not know is a really bad thing. According to Xenophon, being ignorant of yourself and believing and thinking that one knows what one does not know, he used to calculate to be closest to madness. And the answer I would offer to the question how the conversation with Hippias makes Socrates' associates more just, and that's not to say totally just, is that it shows them the right way to deal with pretenders like Hippias. It is beneficial to them by showing them that Hippias is not an entirely reliable authority. I conclude this essay by gesturing at an answer to a larger question. How can refutative games, verbal contests with apparently no holds barred, of the sort that Xenophon Socrates reportedly and occasionally, as in this conversation with Hippias and my interpretation, engages in, be worth the time of Xenophon Socrates? Isn't there a better use of his time? Is it not troubling that Xenophon Socrates ever enters into verbal competitions with interlocutors that are merely trying to show off and to seem clever? Xenophon suggests the answer he would give when he says at the very beginning of book 4 of the Memorabilia that Socrates was no less useful when playing around, paidzone, than when being serious. So although Xenophon much more often depicts his Socrates in non-refutative dialegesthai to show what Xenophon considers more beneficial about Socrates, Xenophon also considers that Socrates' playful refutative dialegesthai was also worthwhile. One reason might be that Socrates wishes to benefit pretty much anybody. That is what the phrase dealing personally with all, lawfully and helpfully, that begins the chapter of the Memorabilia in which Hippias' conversation occurs, suggests. To benefit a particular individual in conversation, Socrates needs to tailor the conversational encounter to the individual with whom he is talking. And Memorabilia, book 4, suggests he did not approach all in the same manner. And in that passage, Xenophon only mentions 3 types, but there might be many more. Competitive dialegesthai is especially suited to some people. It meets them where they are, on their own ground, in the kind of social setting with which they are at home. It is not Socrates' fault that no holds barred verbal competition was an unavoidable conventional social ritual of his era for both grown-ups and youths. It was apparently the appropriate small talk of his day. It provided conversational gambits and the equivalent to conversation, as we say, over the water cooler of his day. Socrates apparently absorbed it as he grew up. Xenophon shows in his Symposium that the mature Socrates was able to contribute masterfully to maximally silly verbal competitions. Xenophon Socrates would not wish to abstain from a social convention of his time that was a highly convenient way of getting certain people to talk with him. And I thank you for your attention.
All right, well, I'll clap on behalf of all the people who are muted. Now we'll turn to comments and discussion. Please keep your comments and questions brief because we have quite a few people and it's time for others. The discussion period will last until about 45 minutes now, until half past the hour. Robin Waterfield.
Thank you. Sandra, I'm sorry, but I think you're making far too sharp a distinction between these 2 types of dialegesthai that you picked on, because you seem to be assuming that in the refutational one, which you describe as just a game and that Socrates is not required to state his beliefs, that people are necessarily insincere. But why should you assume that? Socrates could be perfectly sincere in what he's saying about justice, while taking part in a refutational discussion with Hippias, couldn't he? And if so, that undermines your thesis, I think.
Well, I should have made more distinctions. Yes, I think there is perfectly serious refutational dialegesthai. Refutation is a great way, if you've got a good argument, to demolish a thesis. So I just should have made more distinctions, I guess, just to admit, yes, there's perfectly okay refutative dialegesthai, and then there's game dialegesthai in which you're only doing gamesmanship. But I think that the particular conversation with Hippias, just because of the way it starts with the joking and the mini refutation, and then this challenge, what do you think of this? I think that makes it clear that it's a joking, a game-like conversation rather than a serious refutation. But I agree that there's no necessary triviality about a refutative conversation. It could be sincere. I just think this one is not.
But even if it could be sincere, then your thesis wobbles.
Well, I thought I had those 5 points that make it clear that this particular, my thesis is only
but one of the 5 points was precisely that you say, the last one was precisely that you say Socrates is not saying what he believes, and that's what I'm querying.
Well, but that's supposed to be supported by his sort of brash challenge. Let's see how you like this. I think if he were really saying what he believed, there would be a different kind of preface.
All right.
Yeah, okay. I think we may have to just agree to disagree on this because it's quite a fundamental issue.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Well, thank you for the question. I'll certainly think about that.
Thank you very much.
So
And
let's move
it's nice
on.
to meet you. I've read you for years.
David Johnson.
Thank you for that as well. Sorry, I'd already unmuted myself.
Thanks for your talk. There's an important sense in which, although of course I'm on record as disagreeing, I'd like to agree with you because I share your fundamental impression that Xenophon Socrates has much more in common with Plato's than than most of our colleagues seem to believe. A couple of reasons, though, to take, or just things for you to address that lead me to believe that we have to take Socrates at his word here. The first is how the chapter begins. Now, it's the whole chapter. It's not the conversation with Hippias, but there's that little prelude, as I'm sure you're aware of, at the beginning of 4.4, that begins with something that Xenophon says on another occasion as well, that Socrates did not hide his view about justice. And then Xenophon goes on to briefly talk about how Socrates showed this by his deeds. Okay, yeah. So, and that's one thing. Another, just to throw a couple things out and just to take whichever of these on you want, I wonder what you make of the string of questions in 4.4, 15 through 17. And maybe I'm making too fine of a distinction between your sense of dialegesthai and what strike me as rhetorical questions. They don't read to me like the kind of questions we get in the Euthydemus, say. I mean, Hippias doesn't respond at all. There are formally questions, but they just read to me more like an argument than they seem to be in a different genre to some extent. And finally, then I'll shut up. Even if you're right that this is not a definition of justice, what about 4.6? I mean, it's full of definitions, right? So the larger our shared problem that Xenophon Socrates seems to have definitions at his disposal where Plato Socrates doesn't is exacerbated greatly by what at least have always looked to me in 4.6 is a series of definitions. At any rate, I raised too many points, so you get to choose whichever ones you'd like to knock down rather than taking them all off.
No, that's okay. Well, I normally can't have more than two thoughts in my head, or even more than one thought in my head at a time. So I'm going to kind of defer the first thing. I haven't considered the content of what you think is the argument in chapter 4 that included in that series of questions. And I agree, they are sort of rhetorical, and I think maybe Socrates is responding to the sort of person that Hippias is, and if he really is, as I think, in this mood of wanting to win a game, he's just throwing these questions out, and Hippias doesn't have time to answer them, and so, well, I just need to think more about what the role of the questions are and whether there's really an argument being given that could be sincere. But about chapter 6, I do have something to say, and partly it's because Will Altman already warned me that he was going to ask me about chapter 6. So if you'll allow me, I will tell you what I would say about, I have another paper that deals with some of these other passages. I'll tell you what I would say about chapter 6. Well, he uses the word define there. He says, this is the way Socrates, the manner in which he defined. And I call attention to the phrasing, the manner in which he defined. And so I think that it means that the chapter is going to be about the process by which Socrates engaged in defining. And I observe that define is not a success word. You can engage in defining without actually arriving at a definition, the way I could engage in baking a cake and never produce a cake because things might go wrong. So there's that. that chapter is about the manner in which he engaged in defining. And then there's a bunch of assertions or a bunch of results that come out of the chapter. But at least in my reading of the chapter, and of course this is a different topic, so I can't, we can't go into that really long, but the way these definitions, the things that are, that Xenophon presents as the manner in which Socrates defined, they're all questions that he asks Euthydemus. So every single thing that people think is a definition comes from a question that he asks Euthydemus and that Euthydemus assents to. So even if they were definitions, they wouldn't be definitions that Socrates was committed to. They're all definitions to which Euthydemus commits himself because he answers yes to, or he seems to assent to these questions. And then my other point, or my last point, I think, is that when you look at these claims, for example, here's one. The useful is fine with respect to what it is useful for. That's a question he asks of Euthydemus. Euthydemus seems to assent. So suppose we take an assertion from that. The useful is fine with respect to what it is useful for. Well, if you compare that to the sort of definition that Plato is looking for in his dialogues, he wants something explanatory, something that would enable you to identify, say, the useful. Or if you compare it to a definition of a square is a figure, equal-sided rectangle. That would actually enable you to pick out squares. But the statement, the useful is fine with respect to what it is useful for, isn't that kind of analysis. It's kind of makes interesting conceptual connections, but it's not going to help you pick out anything useful any more than if somebody said a square is the shape of some crackers, or a square is what Elvis Presley referred to in one of his songs. You're so square, baby, I don't care. I mean, I thought of that because I heard it the other night. Well, so those were 4 points. Definition is not a success word. The chapter purports to explain the manner in which Socrates gave definitions. The definitions that are arrived at apparently are not assertions of Socrates. There's Euthydemus's assent to questions. And well, maybe that was it. And the result, and none of them are analyzing definitions of the kind that Plato's Socrates wanted. And I'm quite sure Xenophon knew the difference between an analyzing description of a square, that is a definition, and some true but not helpful for identifying purposes descriptions of what a square is. So I hope that answered your sort of answered your second question.
Okay, let's move on. William Altman.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, I just would pick up on the first part of David's question, because I think it's really important for your thesis to deal with that use of crypto. When he specifically says that he did not conceal his views, there does seem to be a sense in which, on your reading, he isn't simply expressing his views. So I think that you have to bite the bullet and take a stand on why Xenophon introduces 4.4 with a claim that would seem, if anywhere in the Memorabilia, out of place. And so I also wanted to ask you about the very beginning of 3.8.
That's 2 questions. Why don't you just do one question? Well, I told you I can't handle more than one thought at a time. So
okay.
How about the first one?
Okay.
Yeah, so you're worried about the statement that Socrates doesn't hide his views. I don't think I have to say, I don't think I have to bite the bullet here. I don't have to say he's hiding his view about what the just and the lawful are, even though he's giving a playful answer. I don't know if I say in the paper that I don't know what his views about the just and the lawful are. Maybe he doesn't have a definite view. It's kind of a hard question. I mean, there are lots of incoherent things that are said about the just and the lawful. So why would we think Socrates had some pat answer that he went around lecturing or preaching to people? So
because this text makes it seem like he does have a pat answer, and so does 4:6 make it seem like he has a pat answer.
No, it makes it seem like he acts justly. He doesn't hide his views about the just in the sense that he acts justly. I think that's the sense in which he's open about justice. He doesn't do horrible things.
But I mean, you're in dialogue with people that are going to say that this passage 4:4 in particular is a proof text that Socrates believed something that anybody could easily refute, which is that simply the just is the lawful, and that you are dealing with a problem that all defenders of Xenophon kind of have to deal with. And I guess I'm just suggesting that the opening, the claim at the very beginning is more useful to your project than you seem to think.
Well, I don't understand. You'd have to explain it to me, Will.
Maybe that's the point now where we can leave this to further reflection. And next up is Lindsay Hatchie.
Hi there. Thank you for a very interesting talk. My question actually lines up kind of nicely with William, what you just said. I was kind of wondering this whole time, Sandra, I know that you weren't looking at these dialogues in terms of their content. You were looking at the structure and the vocabulary. But I'm wondering what about Socrates saying that the law being lawful is just, like, how that goes against Plato's Socrates. I mean, that's what he believes in the Credo. That's what he talks about in the Statesman as second best. That's a lot of what the Laws is too. I'm wondering what about that makes it like obvious that it's not the same character.
Are you meaning what makes it obvious that it's not the same character to other people? I mean,
I guess so. I'm on your side with this.
Well, I think this isn't the only I'm not really sure how to answer that question with respect to his views about the laws. I mean, the differences that other people have argued for, I mean, Dorian has a list of 22 very big differences between Xenophon Socrates and Plato's Socrates. And this point that one of them has definitions and the other doesn't is just one point. And the question of what their attitude is to the laws would be, I think, a different point. I mean, my thesis or my understanding so far is just about this one passage. Well, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
that's okay. We can pass on. I hope I'll get your name right. Yumi Suzuki.
Thank you so much, Professor Peterson. The fantastic talk, and I learned a lot from previously from your book. So thank you so much. I'm sorry, I'm switching off my video because my place is at now 2 a.m. So I'm so sorry for this.
Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Sister Talk. And I have a question related to I think. Some previous questions and also what Professor Waterfield asked. I was wondering how much belief is matter here, because Socrates said in Plato's dialogue, says something like, say what do you believe to me, and that is what I want to ask you. But it looks like, according to you, it's very belief is not a matter, but it's more like the matter is a proposition or a definition, or even like probably if the word definition is problematic, then it might be something like identification of like equal terms or something like that. So I was wondering, it's more like examination of this kind of identification, then the belief doesn't matter, and then it looks like a little bit different from Plato's Socrates, but maybe when Socrates says says to interlocutor, tell me what do you believe, is something Plato's invention, and if we saw other Plato's early dialogues, them might be very coherent with your point. So I wanted, what my question is, in short, how much belief matter here?
Well, in this particular conversation, I don't think it matters. I think you're definitely right that, I mean, in Plato's dialogues, in some places, Socrates asks or demands, say what you believe. This is really important. But in some places, he doesn't. He lets that requirement go by. I don't have the passages at hand, but I think I cited some of the say what you believe things, and I think I cited them in a footnote of this paper. So yes, I think Socrates, this isn't his favorite kind of conversation, this game sort of thing. He'd rather be serious. He would rather really figure out what people think about what's just and what's lawful. And well, I guess that's my answer. He would certainly prefer in most conversations, or in many conversations, that people say what they believe. But when he's talking to certain people, like Hippias, he doesn't think he's going to get that kind of a conversation. So he goes for this game thing that he always wins one way or another.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you for asking the question and for staying up or getting up so early.
Thank you so much.
Mary Lindsay?
Oh, yes, I had a question that maybe the same questions apply to when they consider any art and science, any techne, that there is no true knowledge or true definition of health or sickness, or power, or any other, people that use power, what power is, or what these skills are. So maybe it's consistent with trying to find a definitive response to the object of any art and science. So they would always be inconclusive, and that's what his method and his point is, not just about the just, but about any object of any art and science, truth, goodness, or beauty. And that would be all the arts and science, because they want, science of medicine or science in physics would want truth. And so I think the inconclusiveness is systemic to all searches for knowledge, or a definition that would stand up, to everyone would agree to.
Well, thank you. Well, hi, Mary. I've seen you for a long time. Yes, I don't know whether he has the opinion in advance that these questions are unanswerable. It's just clear that they never get answered in the dialogues. Well, at least on my view, they certainly don't get answered in Plato, and I don't think they get answered in Xenophon. But I don't know whether he has the general view that the human race just isn't capable of being precise about certain things the way we are capable of being precise about what a square is, or
yes,
what speed is. I mean, he can give a definition of speed in the Laches, but or whoever it is, maybe it's the Meno, but I don't know about the other things. So I guess my answer to your question is, that's a very interesting idea. Are these questions really unanswerable, and does he think so, or not?
Yes, I would agree with you. It's much easier to calculate and do things in math and logic, but all the other questions that they bring up of substance that they explore are always ones that, yes, they can come up with a tentative definition. That's all I meant, but it may not hold up if you look at it, in the way they're looking at it, the ultimate object of the art of healing, or any of them. So that's all. I do agree with you there. Yes, that there's certain things that, yes, we agree to, and different categories there, math, logic, but when it comes to the arts and sciences, we don't have that kind of, you know, conclusiveness or precision. Just as Aristotle would say the same thing, I think, but I don't want to bring up Aristotle, sorry. Yes. Okay. Thank you, thank you. Thanks for your answer.
We're all good people, and one of the things that I have noticed in moderating this series is that when there's a large group like we have, there's a significant number of people who, being good, don't want to put themselves forward and want to leave room for others to ask questions and make comments. And I want to, that can become too many. So I want to encourage those of you who are shy people, thinking about Lake Wobegon and Minneapolis, to put yourself forward and ask a question, make a comment. Meanwhile, let me ask something. It matters, I think, and it certainly matters to me, how, even if I accept that the definitions, the statements in this passage are not put forward as Socrates' views, whether it matters to me whether or not these are put forward as serious views deserving of philosophical investigation. I would think that they are, partly just because of the weight of the concepts. These are really central concepts. And the views are not obviously silly. So a thing that I would like to be able to say is, among the Socratics, identification of the just and the lawful was a live philosophical option that was discussed and probed. Do you think that I can get away with that, or am I putting too much seriousness, reading too much seriousness into it, given the frame on your view?
No, I think it's a very serious topic. But the identification of the just with the lawful, I think Alcibiades' argument against Pericles and just any obvious consideration show us that not all laws are just, and that's just an unfortunate fact of human life. And so maybe they all aim at being just or something like that. So it is a serious topic. What on earth is the relationship between laws and justice? And I don't, well, yeah, I think the topic can be very serious, but the fact that Hippias has opened the conversation with this, claim that he's got something irrefutable that he could put forward, I think that makes it lends to the atmosphere of gamesmanship about this particular exchange. But I agree, the topic is really serious.
Michael Gagarin once said to me that in Athenian courtroom oratory, one thing you could never say is that this law under which I'm being prosecuted, that this law is unjust.
Well, of course.
That was just a thing you couldn't say in Athenian culture. Said this expert in Greek law, I have no view. But it may be that this identification is less obviously wrong to the Athenians than it is to us. But maybe
They didn't Solon reform laws? I mean, they must have thought that
they certainly changed.
I mean, I think,
and it's taken note of. Christopher Moore. Christopher, did you have something?
Yeah. Well, I did, and then I said, and then I figured I would go back to the source and answer the question for myself. The question that I wanted to ask is position of this Hippias conversation in the narrative of book 4. And then I sort of remembered and I saw that you said, well, it's so that the associates of Socrates can hear how someone like Hippias might not be as impressive a teacher as they thought. And I guess I was curious whether you wanted to say more about that. I mean, it's not especially seamless, the integration of Hippias conversation into the conversations that Socrates is presented as having with Euthydemus, and especially 4.3, where Socrates is saying you should, I think he's saying, well, I don't know what you think he's saying, but it seems like he's saying, oh, you should have self-restraint with respect to the gods. And here, let me take you through the story about what that would amount to. So I don't know if you just want to flesh out your view of the way that 4.4 fits into book 4.
Well, it's certainly different from the conversations with Euthydemus, but those are much more serious. Euthydemus is quite a different kind of person than Hippias. He doesn't need to be, well, at least at that point, he doesn't need to be put down. And because the chapter that the conversation with Hippias occurs in says that he was beneficial and lawful, I certainly have to explain how that fits in with the Hippias conversation. I tried to do that. But then also there's this interesting thing that book 4 begins with the observation that Socrates was no less useful when playing around than when being serious. And so maybe that's a summary of stuff in the earlier books, or maybe it's an introduction to book 4, but if it is an introduction to book 4, then one starts looking for, okay, where are the places in book 4 where he's playing around? And there don't seem to be that many amusing conversations in book 4. So that's one way in which it fits in with things. But I agree, it's very different from the conversation with Euthydemus, but Hippias is a very different sort of person.
Okay, well, if we don't have other questions and comments, let's thank Sandra for a very thought-provoking presentation, one that will certainly have me approaching this discussion as someone who's published on the passage, have me approaching this discussion with a great deal lighter touch than I did in writing my own article. So thank you very much, and hope to see all of you in January.
Thank you.